Welcome to The Edge, presented by the Bluntness. Here we take you behind the curtain with amazing people who are pushing the boundaries in cannabis today. I'm your host, Gregory Frye, executive editor at the Bluntness, and today I have a very special guest, New York State Senator Liz Krueger. Senator Krueger, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate you being here. When you think about the failed policies of cannabis prohibition, what are some of the first things that come to your mind?
So the motivation I had to get involved in this issue was looking at the statistics in New York State from about the last decade of who was getting dragged into the criminal justice system for the use of small quantities of cannabis. And it was horrifying to me because it was so radically skewed to young people who were Black and brown being arrested for cannabis smoking, being moved through the criminal justice system, even if they never went to jail on these issues. They ended up with records. They ended up being exposed to police precinct houses, arraignment courts, the court system. They discovered that for things as small as 2 marijuana cigarettes, they could end up not being eligible to apply for certain college grants and loans, not being eligible to live with their families in federally funded housing, not being able to take civil service tests for some of the really good paying jobs that should have been available for their future. And we're talking 90% of the people being arrested being Black and brown, and 10% being white or Asian. And I know for a fact, because I was a white teenager many years ago, that as long as I've been around, and that's a while now, young people of whatever their color was or ethnic identity, I'm a white Jewish woman, were using marijuana. And I looked up the data, and we've been using it at approximately the same rates as everybody else all these years. And yet, for all these years, we've only dragged Black and brown kids through the criminal justice system. And it was just fundamentally wrong. It was the epitome of how we allowed racism to sneak into our criminal justice system and then literally explode certain corners of it. And so my commitment to try to change the drug laws, and specifically cannabis law in New York State, came out of the goal of saying this prohibition has not stopped anyone from using marijuana. The whole concept that we are spending about $500 million a year in New York State to bust people for low-level marijuana usage was doing nothing to stop people from using marijuana. It was just ruining lives and taking away police time and DA time and court time from actually going after actual bad guys. Because if you spend all your time picking up kids on marijuana busts, you're not out there trying to track down the actual criminals. So we were using our criminal justice system in completely the wrong way. It was doing harm, not good. Prohibition had always been a failure. We knew that when we put liquor back on our shelves after liquor prohibition. We know, and maybe we didn't know 50 years ago, but we know now that marijuana has less health effects on us than alcohol or tobacco, two products that I don't think there's any state in the country that's outlawed them, and I'm pretty sure we all tax and regulate them. And yet we were approaching cannabis the same way we would be approaching heroin or fentanyl, which is killing people in our communities and, are worthy of other discussions. But I just said, like, no, this is ridiculous.
You worked on this cannabis legislation for several years, as you said, and I wonder if you could talk about the cannabis fears and misconceptions, hurdles and roadblocks that you ran into, and how you learned to address those in a positive way.
Okay. So I talked to everyone, whoever wanted to talk to me. I have elected officials who'd say, look, I want to be with you, but my community is not there. Will you come and talk to them if I host a town hall meeting? And I say, yes, absolutely. And they go, well, it's going to be a really hostile audience. And I would say, no, it's okay. I can handle hostile audiences. Not to worry. And I would go out, and sometimes they would be really hostile audiences, but they also were audiences who really didn't understand the issue and didn't have a lot of facts. So I would always go out prepared with all kinds of materials that were, the facts that were scientifically backed up. First issue, which I still find amazing, but first issue, it's a gateway drug. This will lead to heroin and fentanyl and opioid addiction. And I would try to walk through, the differences between the drugs and why the vast statistical majority of scientific research studies had shown that marijuana was not a gateway drug, that marijuana could be addictive to some people who suffered from being prone to addiction. Some people are genetically prone to addiction to lots of different substances, but that marijuana had a lower rate of addiction than alcohol or tobacco, and that it was mostly a psychological addiction, which could be fairly easily gotten over. So I would go to, talk to people who were hostile to this issue, and I would try to educate them about the evidence that there was not medical dangers from marijuana, and people would say, well, I've heard that you can use marijuana and then have a psychotic break. And we'd look for the research for them and show them that, you know, there are people who may use too much marijuana and feel dizzy and the room is spinning, and they may define that as feeling like they've totally lost control, but that it's not what doctors describe as psychotic anything. And that most cases of someone, quote unquote, overdosing on marijuana involves falling asleep. And then they wake up and they're better. Um, we talked about the concerns for children's exposure to marijuana, and I agreed that there is some risk to the developing brain from using any kinds of drugs. That's why we also say you can't use alcohol until you're 21. And so, even though some people didn't agree with me, I quickly moved to we were only going to legalize over age 21 for marijuana. Now, that doesn't mean I don't think teenagers are still going to figure out how to get it and use it, because that's what I did and it was completely illegal. Um, but to try to explain that actually marijuana today or before we legalized, it was easier to get marijuana in New York State than alcohol or tobacco. And that's what I was told by police all over the state, that you need ID to get alcohol and tobacco, and fake IDs have actually gotten pretty hard to get away with. If you're looking to bust people for marijuana, you don't have to be the most brilliant detective in the world. just have to have good nose buds. And you don't have to put yourself particularly at risk, because there really isn't any risk from young teenagers using marijuana. But you can get your count up. And yet I have talked to police officer after police officer who says that they feel like they have spent too much of their careers wasting their time just busting kids for marijuana. Like I said, yes, you get your count up on how many arrests you made, but you actually don't go home at night saying, I made our streets safer for the people I care about. And so I also think it's done harm to our police and corrections system, because you discourage people who actually want to really fight crime from wanting these jobs, because they'll say, I didn't want to be a police officer so that I'd be busting teenagers for something that I don't even think is wrong. So I'm not going to do this. So you discourage people from going in to policing for the right reasons. And then you've created this system which just plays on itself over and over again. Because if you arrest them, then you've got to bring them through the DA's office, and then you've got to bring them through court arraignment. And then even if the judge is going to say, we're dropping this case, pay $25, or the DA's office is saying, we're not prosecuting these cases anymore, we told you that, why are you bringing them here? Then you have this little scene, and the kid ends up with something on his record and released. And what I've been told by youth counselors and people who work with young people, even a day's exposure to the criminal justice system can change that kid's outlook on his life forever. And it changes. I know it sounds a little dramatic, but I actually really do believe this. It changes how parents teach their children. And so then it changes the child's relationship with the criminal justice system long before they even are making a decision about whether they would ever think about using marijuana. So I'm going to go back, it's at least 25 years. Rudolph Giuliani was the mayor of New York City. He had a very aggressive police philosophy. I don't think that's news to anyone. And I was having lunch with my colleagues in my organization. I was running a not-for-profit organization. And I'm going to say, like, a third of us were white, a third of us were African American, a third of us were Latino. And most were women, so it was a lot of younger mothers then. And so we're having lunch, and the discussion came up, how old is it when you teach your children? And I'm like, teach your children what? How to not get killed by the police. What do you mean, when do you teach your children how to not get killed by the police? And they were discussing about whether, they used to think it was like 13, then it went down to 11. Now in Giuliani time, they were thinking maybe more like 9. I go, what is this conversation? And they go, oh, you're white. You guys don't do this. I go, what? They were like, if you are a black or brown parent, you know that you have to teach your kids how not to end up getting arrested or shot by a police officer when whatever is going on has absolutely nothing to do with your child. They're just there. I go, you actually have a lesson plan? Yes, we play out a number of scenarios that are very likely to happen to them over and over again, and what they have to do, and how they have to look at the ground, and how they have to not mouth off, and how they have to do this and that, and how they have to keep their hands in plain sight, and how they have to, and just on and on. And they were like, what do white people teach their kids? And I said, if you think you're in trouble, go look for a police officer. They go, that's not how it works in our communities. And I have never forgotten that conversation ever, because I have seen it lived out by people I know, and I have heard it so many times. And it all ties back then right around to, and so then you become 15, 16, 17. You're a teenager. You're supposed to be stupid and survive. Thank you. And so you are going to try things, particularly if you think your parents didn't want you to, or if you think that they make you cool. So you are going to have some marijuana cigarettes in your back pocket. Even if you might decide you really don't like it, you're going to have it. You're going to have one of those police scenes if you're black and brown, and probably not have one of those police scenes if you're a stupid white kid. And the ramifications of just one day and one incident can change everything about your life. And just for some marijuana, just for some
Hmm.
vegetable product.
And really, it's a public health issue, not a criminal issue with all these substances, right?
Well, of course, I mean, that's our whole broader issue with people who have drug addictions.
I wanted to ask you about the MRTA, which when you guys were passing it, I'll never forget. You stood up and you talked about your desire for this legislation to be a model for the other states, and from what I see, it really is the smartest state level legislation on cannabis that I've seen. And I wonder if you could just talk for a minute about some of your favorite nuances of the legislation and what are some of the most important nuances to you?
So we were working with advocates from drug policy organizations and from civil rights organizations, talking about the specific impact on communities of color and people of color all these years. And they were talking about working in different states towards the same goal of legalization. And their messaging was really clear that they were hoping that along with legalization of marijuana, there would be some effort put into undoing some of the harms that happened and even investing money from legalized marijuana in the communities that paid the price for prohibition. And they talked about it in a variety of ways. One, of course, decreasing the criminal penalties affiliated with cannabis completely. And it's like, okay, in my checklist, we did that. Um, Possibly sealing or expunging the criminal records of people who have been caught up in marijuana related penalties so that they could move on with clean records and more opportunities in their own lives to move forward. Because once you have a criminal record, you've really written off a bunch of opportunities for yourself in the economy and in education and in housing. And so we looked into it and concluded we wanted to go for expungement of the records, and we wanted to do it centrally, because it's one thing to say, okay, you can go and find a lawyer, go to court, find a trial date, get a judge to sign off on the expungement and clean your record. But if you do it individually, first off, it's you have to be able to afford a judge, afford a lawyer. You have to take up the time of the courts, and we looked at the number of people in New York State who'd been arrested for marijuana low level related penalties over decades, and was like, wow, it'll be 3,021, and we'll still be working at expungement. So we focused hard on, can we do centralized expungement where the government's Office of Criminal Justice and the Office of Court Administration basically coordinate, cross reference their computers. Like, okay, here's everybody in the system under these criminal penalties. let's press a button over here and expunge their records. Boom, they just all be expunged. So we think we have a system in place that's going to allow that to happen for the vast majority of people with criminal justice records that are marijuana specific. There are some more complicated cases. Sometimes marijuana got mixed in with another charge of some kind. So there will still be people who need to deal with this on a one-on-one basis, but the vast majority, it will be a centralized system, clean the records, they're good to go. Then we heard about desire to make sure that there's an investment in the communities that were hit the hardest. So written into this law in New York, year in, year out, after you first pay for the operation of the agency and the different functions that have to make sure get taken care of, then the revenue from taxation will get split up in a formula way. First, 4% will be sales tax that goes to the local governments. And then the remainder of the taxation will get divvied up 40% to get reinvested in the communities that were hit hardest by the drug wars, for investment in entrepreneurs, new businesses, training to go even into the marijuana business itself, capital grants, loan funds. So money for economic development activity in those specific communities. 20% will go for drug treatment and education about the dangers of drugs, and 40% for education. Everyone always wants more money for education. That's just a fact of life. So we built that in. Then we also built in, and 50% of the licenses will have to go to social equity applicants. And those may be people of color, women, disabled veterans, low-income farmers, because agriculture is a big part of cannabis. It's not just urban issues. So we are actually mandating that half of our licenses go for these purposes, and we created a chief equity officer for the agency whose job will be to make sure we stay on target both for distribution of licenses and for the distribution of the 40% of funds to these communities every year. And so other states talked about it, and they even wrote something into their law about it, but they didn't put any money behind it, and they didn't put any mandates on equity. And we built it all into the law. So I think when people say, what did New York do that nobody else is doing? That old line, we didn't just talk the talk, we walked the walk.